everyone, I'm Tara Lynn of Geek Saga Entertainment, and welcome to the Geek Saga Show's solo podcast series, Impulsive Hyperfocus. First things first, follow me at A Geek Saga on Blue Sky, Facebook, Instagram, and or Threads for insight into my life and, of course, updates about this and other Geek Saga entertainment endeavors. And if you want early access to these and other podcast-only recordings, links to personal Spotify playlists, show notes, writing samples, and more, check out the Geek Saga Entertainment Patreon at patreon.com/geeksaga_entertainment. So I always start these Impulsive Hyperfocus episodes by highlighting one thing about myself, generally something that's at least sort of related to whatever I'm covering in the episode. Usually I keep both whatever I highlight and the contents of these episodes as a whole on the more lighthearted side of things. But for this one, there might be some not so lighthearted content because I'll be talking about my years at a Baptist summer camp this time around. And therefore, it makes the most sense for my highlight to be a bit more about my upbringing in this religion. I grew up in Connecticut, North Central Connecticut to be exact. So yes, it was a bit weird, or at least felt/feels so to me, that I was raised Baptist in an area where the much more prevalent Christian religions were Catholic, Lutheran, maybe Congregationalist, none of which were quite the fire and brimstone level of Baptists, though to be fair, in my experience, New England Baptists weren't really on the same level as like Southern Baptists. Not to say that the religion I was brought up in didn't have its own issues. It obviously absolutely did, being anti-LGBTQ+ and steeped in purity culture that put everything on girls among so many other things. But I suppose that perhaps because we as Baptists were the quote-unquote others in the New England religious community or list of New England religious communities, and because until I was in my late teens, the idea of megachurches, religious rock bands, and the like were something we equated to what seemed to us to be over-the-top Southern Baptist culture. I don't know, probably I'm digressing a bit here. So, trying to get back to the subject at hand, I was raised as a Baptist in New England in a pretty small church. I'd say for most of my life, it had fewer than 100 attendees to any non-holiday Sunday service. Until I was in maybe middle school, we only sang songs from the hymnals, though eventually they did add a praise band to the mix and started putting those like shorter, sort of more modern songs up on a projector screen at the front of the church and whatnot. So... But even before that, the man who was pastor of our church when I was much younger, at some point decided he didn't want to be a pastor anymore. From what I remember, he stepped down of his own accord, and I truly don't believe there was anything untoward about it. It was more about him simply not wanting to be a church leader anymore, I think. And in fact, when he made the decision and they found a new pastor for our church and he left our church entirely, he merely went to another church that was maybe 30 minutes away and continued to be an upstanding member of that congregation, as far as I know. And the reasoning for his even doing that, like going to a different church entirely, if I'm remembering correctly, was that he felt that his remaining even as just a member of our church could undermine the new pastor. Granted, I say all of this, but also understand that I was super young when it all happened. I can't remember how old exactly, but I would say I was between like 7 and 9 years old, and I'm pretty sure it was more on the like 7 or 8 side of things. And even though I've since talked to my mom about what all happened there, there's still this weird why the heck did it happen this way mystery surrounding how when this pastor stepped down and supposedly decided to attend a different church for what have always sounded like legitimate reasons, several families who were longtime members of our church, in some cases men who were deacons and the like, followed this former pastor even though he wasn't leaving to run another church. And yeah, something about that has never really sat right with me, even if the larger part of me still doesn't believe anything nefarious was happening. Insert shrug emoji here, I guess. All of that sort of weird history aside, though, personally, I only left my childhood church when I was about 18 years old and a freshman in college. And in the end, I left because I felt like the church leadership had become, well, greedy. Shocking, right? Lol, not. Granted, we aren't talking righteous gemstone levels, but suffice it to say that while the church's membership had grown steadily throughout my, at the time, short lifespan, and had certainly outgrown the physical building that had been the building for our church my entire life, the idea of building some over-the-top new church building with a huge sanctuary and shit like an indoor basketball court had become a thing that they talked about more than once in every single sermon. And at one point, I, a college freshman with no job at the time, thanks to being in school on a full scholarship, expressed to my mentor from the college group how awful it made me feel that they were constantly talking about how every church member should give to the building fund when I didn't have any money of my own to give. At which point I was told that maybe I should do something like hold a tag sale, a garage or yard sale for those not from New England, and sell some of my things to raise money for the building fund. I don't think my jaw literally dropped, but it sure as hell figuratively did, at the very least. I nodded along and made like generic noises of assent, and that was the second to last time I ever stepped foot in that church. I did go back for an Easter service something like 8 or 9 years later. I said this wasn't going to be an entirely fun episode, but to be honest, I didn't really mean to kick it off with such, if not dark stories, and certainly not fun or positive ones. So on that note, I'm going to dive into the real meat of this Impulsive Hyperfocus installment, which will hopefully come across at least somewhat more positive than this intro, because at the end of the day, I really did have some great times at and some interesting stories from church camp. My last official year at summer camp was 25 years ago this summer, which, wow. I suppose I would usually be expected to insert some sort of facetious, gosh, aren't I old comment here, but honestly, I don't feel that way. If anything, reminiscing about church camp with one of my friends and both of my sisters has made me feel, if not young, then certainly younger. So to kick this off, first things first, let's talk about the location, y'all. While the very first year I went to what we called junior camp, which started at some elementary school grade that I don't remember, maybe 3rd or 4th, was at some place with actual cabins and outdoor showers isn't really the right term, but like the showers were in their own building and it was a separate building from where we slept. From my second year on, we were always at Camp Monadnock in Jaffrey, New Hampshire. The reason I bring up the first place having actual cabins and outdoor showers and shit is because Monadnock had, well, weird accommodations. Because normally you think summer camp and you think the aforementioned cabins and campground style showers, right? Instead, we got dorm style rooms in one of 2 large buildings on the property. One was just this big old square or rectangular 2 or maybe 3-story building called The Ark, and the other was a legit Victorian mansion that we straight up called The Mansion, which was built in 1913 and had 3 stories and a basement. Admittedly, I had to peruse the camp's website to remember that the Ark was actually called that. And during my perusal, I also discovered that the mansion has a name as well. They call it Carlson Manor, but to be fair, I don't know if it always had that name or what, because again, we always just called it the mansion. Also weird, because side note, one of my great-great-aunt's last name was Carlson, though that was her married name, so, not technically a family name. Anyway. Supposedly, there are also cabins on the property, but I honestly don't remember if those existed when I went there. If they did, I sure do not remember them. Anyway, the girls usually stayed in the mansion while the boys stayed in the Ark. The mansion was all just bedrooms and bathrooms, while the bottom floor of the Ark was actually common areas and the dining hall that we all ate in. Now, I say the girls usually stayed in the mansion because there was one year where for some reason we stayed in the Ark. Originally, my thought was that they just totally switched where the boys and girls stayed that year, but then my sister said she thought there was another reason. At which point I started wondering if maybe that one year there were just so many girls that they had filled up the mansion with girls and then had to put some of us in what would have been the boys' rooms. But my sister thinks it had something to do with us getting there late that year, and the only rooms that were left available in the mansion were in the basement, and our youth director and his wife refused to make us stay in said basement. And I wouldn't be shocked if she's right about that, because a couple of years earlier, we'd gotten relegated to said basement, and pretty much every single one of us got sick from what had to have been a mold infestation. Like, y'all, there were black spots on the mattresses. It was constantly damp. It smelled awful. No one else except those of us staying in the basement got sick either. So it wasn't some sort of too many kids in close quarters situation. So anyway, yeah, my sister might be right about some of us staying in what would usually be the boys' cabin because of that. And then my friend Marge, who's the only person I met at church camp and have stayed in touch with for all these years, told me, I think it was my first year, which would have likely been 1998, when we also stayed in the Ark. I remember it being right at the top of the stairs from the dining hall/pool. I think that year we only had like 4 of us from my church, my sister, me, my best friend, and maybe one other girl with the youth pastor's wife. If I remember correctly, we may have had our own bathroom, which was amazing, and something I thought about often later on in the mansion where 20 plus dirt and grass covered girls were sharing a bathroom to get ready for chapel. We also were in the basement one year. I want to say I was headed into junior year when we were down there. It was just a big bunk room or two. So, I don't know. My sister could be partially right, especially if Marge's church was really small. And I think ours wasn't huge that year either. Like, we maybe had enough girls to fill 1 or 2 small rooms in the Ark. So I maybe the basement wasn't even open that year in the mansion. I don't know. But either way, whatever. It doesn't really matter. Point being, that was a weird year because we had to stay in the Ark, and it was like we were near the pool. Like Marge mentioned, the pool was an indoor pool that was kind of tacked onto the edge of the Ark, but that whole half of the building, even, the floor above it or whatever, just smelled like chlorine and was awful. I mean, it was not as bad as the basement in the mansion, don't get me wrong, but still. I don't know. It was much nicer staying in the mansion, even though Marge was saying like, oh, we had our own bathroom, but we usually got lucky with my church, and, we would maybe have 8 girls or 10 at most, and I think even that was extreme, in a room at the mansion, and we always had a bathroom for our room, so it wasn't like the worst thing ever. But anyway, moving on to a bit of a side note, having perused the current website for the camp, there are a bunch of activity options that I do not at all remember existing for us. I feel like maybe I remember there being archery available, but I could be misremembering that. It might have been something we could do during free time, or possibly part of our game time one day during the week. More on game time later. However, now they also have shit like a climbing tower, a ropes course, mini golf, and paintball, and I definitely don't remember any of that being stuff that was made available to us. Marge did point out that she remembers us having archery and BB guns. Also, there was a basketball court, and when she mentioned that she thought the cabins I brought up earlier were behind the basketball court, she thinks that the traveling speakers we sometimes had for chapel stayed in them. Her description brought up what I can only describe as a snapshot in my mind of said cabins behind the basketball court, so there is that. With that out of the way, I think the next best topic is a day in the life at Monadnock Bible Camp. First things first, you get up early to try and snag a shower before breakfast, which was honestly way earlier than it needed to be. 7 a.m., 7:30, maybe 8. It might have been 8, which now that I'm thinking about it doesn't feel that early, but I don't know, for fuck's sake, it was summer. Why were we having to get up that early, And yeah, I get it. Summer camps always make you get up early, and while I shouldn't say I'm not a morning person, I also have never been great at functioning super early in the morning, so whatever, I'm whining about this a bit. I will say that there was one morning of the week, I can't remember which one, where the main breakfast item was fried dough, and my god, I lived for that morning because that fried dough was good. Other than that, breakfast was just very basic breakfast food. Anyway, after breakfast, we would rush back to our rooms to finish getting ready for inspections. Again, more on that later, but let's just say you always hope they did the boys first and or started somewhere in the mansion that involved your room not being one of the first. After inspections was morning chapel, and my not so great recall told me that there might have been something after this, like a devotion time. Thankfully, Marge clarified that we definitely had devotionals after chapel, and she believes we were split either by age or by age and assigned gender. Pretty sure that post-devotionals was lunchtime. Then it was game time for the girls. There might have been a more clever or possibly even more stupid name for game time, but whatever. Girls' game time was always first, and at the same time as we were doing games, the boys had their swim time, and after that we swapped, and it was boys' game time, girls' swim time, because God heaven forbid you have boys and girls in the pool together. Or, even playing sports together, I guess. And I use the term sports very loosely here. I need to do a quick break to talk about forced swim time, because I already mentioned the indoor pool. It was a totally nasty indoor pool with so much chlorine in it that I'm surprised it did not turn every blonde kid's hair green. It was in a room where the walls and ceiling were made of clouded glass, and it smelled so strong that it stank up half the damn building, as I already kind of touched on a little bit earlier. And also, LOL, of course you couldn't wear a bikini or even a tankini from what I remember. Even though boys and girls had separate swim time, for fuck's sake. It was like, oh my god, the boys might see you walking to or from the pool in your revealing swimsuit, because of course it was about keeping the boys from being lustful due to what you, the girls, were wearing. Kill me now. Marge noted that there were so many wet t-shirts worn over bathing suits during that time. She also remembers there being one time a week where boys and girls had swim time together, but to be honest, I don't remember that, and she was a couple years younger than me, so that might have happened after I aged out of camp. Or perhaps I just don't remember because, I'll be honest, I had my period every year at summer camp so that I did not have to go swimming. And of course, I didn't actually have my period every year, the same week of August when we were at summer camp. But I absolutely used that as an excuse every chance I possibly could. Whatever, either way, the girls' swim time / boys' game time was, I believe, followed by free time. I honestly can't remember how long free time was. It was at least an hour. It might have been 90 minutes or 2 hours, though the latter seems way longer than I can recall. And most of that time was spent getting ready for the next thing, which was, of course, dinner. And after dinner was evening chapel, followed by announcements of who won what that day. Except for maybe inspections, they might have announced who received or lost points for inspection stuff, I want to say right after morning chapel. But yeah, other than that, all the game winning announcements and whatnot were made after evening chapel. Another thing I'm not 100% sure about is there being a chunk of free time that was very short, like maybe 30 minutes. It could have been an hour, but again, that feels like way longer than I recall it being between evening chapel and the last things of the night, which, now that I'm thinking about it, the announcements of who won what might have come after that post-chapel break, but whatever. There was a little bit of a break where we would actually hang out with people because we weren't spending the whole time, getting ready for the next thing. And finally, the night ended with, movie time. You can't really call it movie time because we would watch something, but it was usually just episodes of whatever shows our teams were centered around that year. Another thing I'll touch on in a little bit, or VeggieTales. But not even full episodes of VeggieTales, mostly just silly songs with Larry, And now it's time for Silly Songs with Larry, the part of the show where Larry comes out and sings a silly song. I will never forget, oh, where is my hairbrush? And everybody's got a water buffalo. Yours is fast, but mine is slow. I had never heard of VeggieTales before camp, and I was already, I want to say, going into my sophomore year of high school at the very youngest when they actually started playing these at the end of the night. Shoot, it might have even been the summer before my junior year. I was late in my teenage years, but still found VeggieTales and especially Silly Songs with Larry just absolutely hilarious. And then, of course, after that, we all just were shuffled off to bed, which usually did not mean us going directly to bed. We would be in the room in our pajamas, but, like, especially teenage girls giggling and whispering about boys and stuff like that. And yeah, that doesn't quite lead directly into what I have to talk about next, but it's as good of a segue as I'm going to get. So next up, I have to talk about what's pretty much just a big old mix of cringe, as in a mix of cringe religion and cringe morning inspections and cringe cliques and cringe despite it supposedly being a religious camp. Listen to the crazy things we did. I'm going to start off with cringe religion just to kind of get this part out of the way. I hope that you didn't come here to get a whole lot of inside information on the religion aspect of church camp, which I'm sure some people might be here for, but I really don't have that much to say about it. To be quite honest, I've put up some serious mental blocks against a lot of the really questionable and deep-seated stuff that I was taught in my younger years, but I will touch on a few things that I do remember along with some additional commentary that I received from Marge. As I already mentioned, we had chapel twice a day, plus an additional time for devotions after morning chapel. I believe we could also earn points for our teams by memorizing verses because, nothing says godliness like rote memorization. I think we were maybe assigned these verses during the post-morning chapel devotional time and had until the next day's devotional time to memorize them. At least I hope that's what it was, and not that we had like minutes or hours to do so. And while it's not like kids were publicly shamed for not memorizing verses, you'd always see the counselors spending extra time with the same kids and sometimes even being kind of pushy with them to do said memorization, which is just big yuck, especially knowing that they certainly didn't have any consideration for the fact that some people just aren't good at memorizing shit, especially like that, let alone that some of the kids might have had learning disabilities. And then there were the pushes for the usual things, getting saved mainly, but as the week went on, it became more specific, like the push to commit your entire life to Christ. As in basically announcing to camp that if you were a boy, you would, for example, become a pastor or a missionary. While if you were a girl, you would, of course, become a pastor's wife or a missionary's wife because, back then, a female pastor or a female leading a mission trip is just not something that happened. And Marge also brought up how intense the evening chapel sessions were, including that there were a lot of tears, and she also reminded me of a skit featuring the song Total Eclipse of the Heart that was a camp favorite. I didn't remember this skit at first, but, thank God for Google and all that, because once I found a video of it, well, let's just say that brought back a wave of semi-traumatic thoughts and memories, and I could not finish watching it. And honestly, when I say I couldn't finish watching it, I think I watched like 30 to 45 seconds of it before I shut that shit down. To be fair, while Marge does remember seeing this skit at camp, I only recall seeing it at other youth group events that we attended throughout the year, but she did have 3 summers of camp after I aged out. And either way, after being reminded of this travesty, even though I couldn't bear to watch the whole thing, I have to at least give a basic description of it because wow. Basically, it's a wordless skit set to the song Total Eclipse of the Heart, showing a person, and I quote, caught in a sea of sin and Christ coming to rescue her. That's right, her. And I confirmed with Marge, we both remembered that so-called person caught in a sea of sin always being played by a girl. Because of course it was. And I have to quote Marge here when she said, because the weight of sin always landed heavier on girls. And just, yep. Either way, she's right that at evening chapel, they really went out of their way to make us campers feel all kinds of ways about our so-called sins. Marge even admitted that she for sure broke up with a boyfriend immediately after camp more than once, which sighs at religion culture. And of course, that brings me around to Ye old obsession with abstinence! Not just it being pressed on us. Oh, no, no, no. At camp, even just holding hands with a member of the opposite sex could get you in big trouble. And kissing? Ha! Kissing could get you straight up kicked out, if I remember correctly. But, of course, people totally found dark places to have makeout sessions, though, to be fair, I never did that. Truth be told, by the time I was probably considered attractive enough to be a girl guys would want to try to hook up with at camp, all the guys who were interested in doing that, or who I would have been interested in doing it with for the most part, had moved on. And then also, despite all of this, abstinence talk and the fact that we weren't even supposed to hold hands, let alone kiss, there was this huge push for how we had to have a hetero date for a banquet. And I'm not saying that the counselors or the leaders pushed it on us, but definitely your fellow campers expected anybody who was, cool to have a hetero date for banquet. Banquet being the sort of fancy dinner on Friday night, the final night of camp. And my friend Marge agreed that the pressure for a banquet date, and I'm quoting her here, "Man, oh man, I don't think I ever had one in all the years I was there, even when I was camper of the week and considered popular and pretty well known / liked. I was just not that girl." Too many wicked references in one paragraph? I don't think so. End quote, by the way. She also told me that she had a friend who gave a guy a hand job during chapel, and Marge was horrified about this. I did ask for some clarification on why she was horrified, and it seems that her reaction was a combination of being a prude and also being worried about the possibility of getting caught. From our conversation, I'd say that it was 40% her being a prude, but the other 60% was more along the lines of, but what if you got caught, OMG? Personally, I was only ever informed of a couple of my friends making out with guys they met at camp, but the stories I heard about these situations usually featured them doing it at night before we were herded off to bed. Or maybe it was more during that time between evening chapel and when we would sit and watch episodes of a show or whatever. And looking back, who the heck knows if simple / basic making out was all that it was, or if that's simply all they were willing to admit they did to me or our other friends. Obviously, now I'm in the no judgment either way mode because we were all emotional, horny teenagers. And if one of those camp hotties had wanted to hook up with me, I probably would have thrown maybe not all caution, but for sure some caution to the wind. Anyway, Marge did also tell me that she ended up hooking up with a guy from camp well after the fact. Sadly, it was a pretty traumatic and religiously weird experience for her. And then to top it all off, he emailed her years later, years after they'd hooked up, and apologized for treating her that way when she was a daughter of the king, whatever the fuck that means. I think it has something to do with being a child of God, but I don't know. It's so fucking weird, man. Religious people are weird. So I have absolutely zero idea how to segue into this next bit, which whatever. I'm just going to bite the bullet and get into morning inspections. Because one thing I can't stop thinking about is why the heck we were given practically military level inspections of our rooms every morning. They were so rabid about it. Sure, we would get or lose points for our teams, again, more on the teams later, based on these inspections, but I wonder if it was some sort of cleanliness is godliness situation, which, not to mention, and again, I'll get into the team activities and point stuff a little more as we go on, but honestly, it's one thing for people to not be good at the games or physical activity stuff, or of course at the rote memorization bullshit. But the room inspections were pretty much pure teamwork, yet every year there were always those people who tried to do nothing while the rest of us actually cleaned. Marge admitted that she'd completely forgotten about inspections until I mentioned them. Funny enough, though, she was college roommates with my sister Christy for at least, I think only their first semester of college. And just to be clear, this was not a religious college. And Marge said, "I'm sure Christy can tell you that my superpower is surely not keeping a clean room. Sorry, Christy, I'm on ADHD meds now, and while I'm not perfect, it's gotten better. And honestly, girl, I feel you about those ADHD meds helping you with certain things, if not cleaning for my part, because our mom drilled very specific house cleaning into us from a very young age. But that's an entirely different, I don't even know if that's a story. It's just a thing that happened when I was young. My mom is a very, very, maybe overly clean person. But anyway, there were weird things about inspections, like we would get extra points for certain things, including if anybody had items from the Coleman brand, like Coleman sleeping bags or Coleman coolers. And this was because the head guy of the camp, like the leader of this group of churches, his last name was Coleman. But also, I don't know, Coleman items aren't exactly cheap. Or at least they weren't back then compared to, just picking up a non-branded item at Walmart or whatever. So it feels extra cringe that anyone who had these, Coleman sleeping bags or any other Coleman camping item would earn extra inspection points for their team. I don't know. We would also lose points for things like dust bunnies under the beds, though the general idea of this is less weird than the fact that there was a name for them. And when they would make the announcements about like who got and lost points for what regarding morning inspections, the way the name was said was just ridiculous. I'm gonna try to do it without cracking up, but in this very deep, because it was a man who was doing these particular announcements. It was a very deep, long, drawn out doofballs. So the name was Doofballs, but it was always said like that. And I don't know, it was just like these doofballs were talked about like the worst thing you could have is a big, nasty, quote unquote, doofball under your bed, which I don't know why. There's so many more gross things that could be found, but doofballs were the thing that people made a big deal about. Again, there's no truly good segue here, but wow, do I need to talk about cringe cliques next. Because the social aspects of our weird little church summer group were something else, to say the least. There were clique issues out the wazoo. I was definitely the odd kid out with my youth group my first few years of senior camp. A lot of my so-called friends were the cool crowd, even in those early years, but while they were generally nice, many of them seemed to barely put up with me hanging around with them. Honestly, once most of the girls I tagged along with graduated and I was the oldest one from my church, which I believe was my last 2 years at camp, it got so much better. Then there was I don't know if it was called the Tall Girls Club, but I feel like it was something along those lines. And it was basically, when we were lined up for games and stuff, it was always by height. And I was always in the last 3 to 4 people. I think I was actually the tallest before Marge started coming to camp, but I'm close to 5'9". I might have been more like 5'8" back then, but and Marge is I think 5'11". Marge, if you're listening to this, excuse me if I got your height wrong. But so anyway, the later years of camp, when I was kind of one of the older kids and considered much cooler than I was my first couple of years of senior camp, we just had this kind of ringleader tall girls group that, I don't know, not only were we always together for the games and stuff, but we would hang out outside of that as well. And Marge did say that this was early on for her, so it must have changed later in her camp years in terms of us kind of always having this group that was together at the end of the line for games and sticking together some outside of that as well. But I don't know, especially when you're that young, being the tall girls isn't all that fun a lot of the time. So having this group of tall girls that were kind of we're cool too, is just a really good memory for me. And I think for Marge as well. I mean, listen, she is again the only friend that I made at summer camp that I'm still friends with to this day. And that says a lot because again, it's been 25 years since I even went to this camp. So, of course, when I was researching stuff for this episode, I went back through old pictures of mine because I've always been a big picture taker and I put scrapbooks together when I was young. So I have a lot of pictures and stuff from my years at camp. But looking through these pictures, I found, I want to say it was the summer of 1999, we had this group that we called the Circle of Friends. It could have been 2000, but I think it was 1999. And it was basically when we, I don't know, self-styled, I guess, but we kind of were the cool kids. We would steal all of the Adirondack chairs that they had in front of the main building, the Ark, and we'd put them in a circle. And I don't remember for sure, but it might have been a sort of you can't sit with us situation. I hope not, because I hate the idea of ever having been that type of person. But for sure, whenever there were small spots of free time or during actual free time, if we weren't spending the whole thing getting ready for dinner or whatever, we would talk about who was going to do it. And then a couple people would rush to grab all the Adirondack chairs and put them in this circle so that we could all sit together. And when people would ask if they could take one, and we'd be like, nope, these are taken, even if we were still waiting for people to show up. So yeah, not so cool for the cool kids either way. And then, oh my God, this is possibly even worse. In the summer of 2000, there actually was a cool kids table. And once I saw the picture and the caption I'd given it, I remembered exactly where that table was. It was in I want to say it was the back corner of the front side of the dining room. That doesn't really make sense probably, but it was a corner table, but back corner of the full room no matter what. And we would send people down to the dining hall as early as possible for dinner. I mean, at times the dining hall wasn't even open, but someone from our group would be waiting there to take the table because we had to make sure that no one stole our table. And one night for sure, some other kids definitely did take our table and we were pissed. And to be honest, obviously looking back now, it's like, oh my God, who cares? And also, it wasn't like the tables were assigned. But at the same time, we'd been sitting at that table most nights in a row. So in a way, it's like, okay, you kids rushed down there to take this table that we've been sitting at for 3 or 4 nights in a row at this point, knowing that's where we always sit, that's where we want to sit. Clearly a passive-aggressive move on the other kids' part. But why we got so mad about it was just stupid and silly and very teenager and, whatever. Going back to Marge's input just for a moment, she told me that she remembers some of the churches being cliquier than others. When she started going, her church was really, really small. So they didn't know anyone. They had no idea what to pack or how to prepare for camp. Then after that first year, they knew that, and this is her story, not mine, and I'll get into why I'm clarifying that in a moment, but after that first year, they knew that every day you basically needed a cool outfit to wear to breakfast, morning chapel, and lunch, then a sportier outfit to wear to games with a couple that you knew would get very dirty, then dressier outfits for dinner and nighttime chapel, and a more the dressiest outfit for the banquet. Now, funny enough, I don't remember needing a cool outfit for breakfast and morning chapel. I think I just wore whatever I was going to wear up until game time. Unless it was a day where we were playing a game where we knew we would get really messy and dirty, and there were a couple of those. But of course, any outfit that I wore in the morning and or of course to games was different than what I would wear to dinner and evening chapel. Today, me would have just schlumped to breakfast in my pajamas, but for sure that was not a thing we would do in the 90s. Anyway, cliques and clothes aside, I've mentioned inspections and games more than once, so it's past time to talk about the uber competitiveness that they fostered between the 2 teams that they set up for the week of camp. First, Marge reminded me that we were given hats and maybe bandanas. I only remember hats, though, with our team names on them. And we had to wear them, not at all times, because I know we didn't wear them during dinner. And I'm pretty sure we also didn't wear them during breakfast, maybe, but definitely during game time. And I feel like there was a portion of evening activities where we had to wear them that I'll talk about in a second. It was kind of attached to chapel / the movie or show time. But either way, she thinks it was part of the points thing. They counted who was wearing the hats from each team, either at morning chapel or during games, or maybe both. And we got extra points if everybody on the team was wearing their really, really stupid hat. I also don't remember all of the team names from all of the years because, again, I went for many, many years and it's been a while since I've been there. But thanks to my aforementioned amazing photo documentation and the input I received from Marge and my sisters, I do remember 4 sets of teams, I think. I believe one was actually from junior camp because my youngest sister remembers it and I also have vague memories of it, but we only went to senior camp together for 1 year and I definitely know what the team names were for that year. So yeah, it's got to be junior camp. And it was, get this shit, oil companies. One was definitely Texaco, and after discussing with my sisters, I'm pretty sure, though not positive, that the other was Sunoco. To be fair, it might have been Mobil, but I feel like Sunoco makes more sense because, Texaco, Sunoco. Either way, why? Was Big Oil sponsoring our tiny little church camp that year? No, really though, I'm joking about the sponsorship thing. However, also, for real, why were our teams named after oil companies? That is so weird, especially as the other 3 years worth of teams that we worked together to recall, again, all from senior camp, were based on TV shows. There was Knight Rider versus Dukes of Hazzard, Lone Ranger versus Zorro, and Beverly Hillbillies versus Gilligan's Island. And tell me why that year the Beverly Hillbillies team hat said Hillbillies Tribe. Ugh. According to Marge, after my last year of camp, the first year that I wasn't there was Survivor versus some other reality show, while Summer Camp 2002, aka the first one post 9/11, was Army Rangers versus Navy SEALs. And in 2003, it was, I guess, back to more classic teams with Batman versus Superman. I really wish I'd been there for the Batman versus Superman year, honestly. Speaking of teams and the game times that I've mentioned, quite a few times already in this podcast, obviously I need to talk about the insane games we played. For sure, we played totally normal ones. Don't ask me what those ones were, because the only ones I really remember are Tube Tug and Annihilation. And listen, I'm not saying that some level of competitiveness is bad. But again, some of these games, the 2 I just mentioned especially, were so over the top. We were basically being encouraged to softcore, or maybe not so softcore, beat each other up. Okay, maybe not really, but they totally turned a blind eye to some shit, especially in Annihilation. But first, I want to go over Tube Tug. It was a stack of tubes, I think 5 of them, can't quite remember. They were stacked largest on the bottom to smallest on top, and then there were a bunch of smaller items stored inside the sack, like little rings, balls, stuff like that. I could be wrong, but I feel like maybe the smaller items that you could grab and run with were worth fewer points, while the bigger items, namely the tubes, but especially the bigger tubes that you had to actively fight for, were worth way more. And with 2 teams, each team had 2 sides of the square that surrounded the field. So you were supposed to grab what you could and get it over either one of the sides that belonged to your team. And Marge also reminded me that we were, as always, lined up by height. And with each team getting 2 sides of the square, the shortest girls would actually be standing next to the tallest girls from the other team. However, they gave us numbers based on height, and they would call, I think, 4 numbers at a time. But whatever numbers they called, they did it so that, for instance, us tall people weren't up against tiny little 12 or 13-year-olds. And let me tell you, we were not nice about any of this. There was grabbing, pushing, pulling, running, and probably some additional not so nice stuff in between, all in the name of getting as many items, especially those dang tubes, across one of your team's lines. But even Tube Tug could not match up to the king of all Camp Monadnock games, Annihilation. This game was, even more so than Tube Tug, the highlight of game time every year, at least for me. The field for it was a big square again, but this time divided into 2 triangles with the goals located in the farthest opposite corners of the triangles. The goals themselves were holes dug in the ground with an empty 5-gallon bucket placed inside each hole. The ball that we played with was, get this, a Crisco-coated volleyball. And you earned points by getting this greasy, nasty volleyball into the other team's bucket. The main and probably only real, written rule was that you had to play on your hands and knees. Mainly, your knees were not supposed to leave the ground. Other than that, tackling, grabbing, and general roughhousing weren't just allowed, they were encouraged. And let me tell you, I was ace at this game. Being tall plus strong from working on a horse farm helped for sure. And for real, I went to that camp and played this game every summer from, I think, 1996 to 2000. And I want to say that my team won it every year. Looking back, I have to wonder whether this game was just a way for them to get us church camp kids to channel our sexual or other frustrations. Not sure how that worked out considering some of the things I've already touched on, but whatever. As I think I've made clear, I fucking loved Annihilation. Nor was I the only one. My sisters and Marge also raved about the game when we were reminiscing, despite the fact that, as Marge pointed out, it left us with bruises and grass stains galore. Those alone were actually their own kind of trophies, if we're being honest here. However, Marge did remind me that usually the biggest girl on each team would get singled out to sit on the goal in hopes that she would be immovable, which, there's that cringe factor again. Outside of game time, another specific competitive thing that I have to mention is skits. Personally, I can't remember if this was a one-night thing or if we did several throughout the week, though Marge thinks these were a nightly thing. Either way, however often we did these weird skits, from what I remember, we were totally allowed to pick on, put down, make fun of the other team, and just why? But also I'm over here wondering if I'm just remembering it this way because that's what my team did the 2 years I was most involved and therefore have the most vivid memories from. Who knows? That said, what was really cool about the skits and stuff was that we had to get pretty darn creative. Leading up to our week at camp, we never knew what the teams would be, let alone what team we would be on. So we had to use what we brought with us or what we could find on property that we were actually allowed to use. So we were putting together what were essentially closet cosplays, not to mention actually writing these little skits and then, of course, acting them out. I don't really have a ton of specific memories about the skits other than, like I said, I was really involved in them my last 2 years. But Marge pointed out that she vividly remembers one of the guys from my church, actually, being Jed Rock, like The Rock, during a Beverly Hillbillies skit and yelling out, "If you smell what Jed Rock is cooking!" Because again, we were creative as fuck with these skits, and that even included whatever pop culture references we could insert, even when our teams were based on, say, TV shows from the 60s, 70s, early 80s. Anyway, last but not least and all that, I tried to gather random summer camp stories to include, but again, I'm 25 years removed from summer camp, and the other 3 people I talked to about this are anywhere from 22 to 24 years removed from it. So it's not surprising that it was kind of impossible for us to recall any specific stories. However, I will say that my sister Christy brought up this absolutely ridiculous thing regarding Alf the Pope. And by Alf, I mean Alf, like from the TV show. And I have some very vague memory about someone maybe bringing a stuffed Alf or an Alf blanket to camp one year. I'm fairly certain it was one of the guys from our church, but I have no idea how it became a thing or why the girls, and not just the girls from our church, because Marge very much remembered this too and got a kick out of talking about it, even though we can't remember specifics. So yeah, like not just the girls from our church, all these girls were so into it. I do think it might have had something to do with the fact that the kid who we're all pretty sure brought it was considered hot. But anyway, Alf as the Pope became a thing that year to the point where one of the girls from our church even dressed up as the Pope for inspection one morning to get us extra points. And because I have so few memories of this whole situation, all I can think now is like, what? Why? We were not Catholic, so why was this a thing at all? I wish I could remember more about it other than it being really hilarious. I mean, to the point where I do have memories of laughing so hard over it that week that, like your stomach muscles are hurting because you cannot stop laughing. So even though I don't remember details, it was a fun thing to recall. And then Marge and I also talked about how we were only there for 1 week in the summer. And it was weird because it was only these churches from what Marge called our BBCE group. I don't even remember what that stands for, but she remembered my church from East Longmeadow. There was a big church from Chicopee. Actually, it was the church that the pastor I mentioned at the beginning of this episode switched over to after he left our church. So, and then Marge's church from Cape Cod. There was another pretty big one from Rhode Island. And there were probably some other smaller ones as well that we just don't specifically remember. But despite only being there for 1 week, we would all bond so much. And I guess maybe the religious aspect, particularly the, very emotional evening chapel sessions, but also the team aspects of it, the playing games with each other, maybe not so much against each other. I definitely remember years where generally like friends of mine from other churches would end up on a different team and I would be so upset about it. But yeah, I don't know. We all bonded a lot. It's a little bit sad to me that I never stayed in touch with so many of these people, but that's kind of the way things go because, again, when I was going, the internet was barely like a common thing unless you were maybe entering college around that time and had an actual like network. So it was harder to keep in touch with people, but we would a lot of times carry around like notebooks and get people's phone numbers. Sometimes, like very rarely, but sometimes toward the end, like the last year, emails, addresses, even like actual physical addresses, teenagers exchanging phone numbers and addresses at a summer camp that they have maybe just met at like a few days before. I don't know. Anyway, this group of churches did do other things together during the year. There was something called Teen Involvement, which was a 1-day thing that was like a competition where they had like a theater competition and a singing competition. And I think there was also art as well and maybe some other things. And then there was Super Bowl, which was an all-night event. I honestly don't know if Marge's church went to this. I don't remember that they did, but it started with a minor league hockey game, and then we would either go bowling first or roller skating and then switch. Like, so if we went bowling first, we'd go roller skating last. If we went roller skating first, we'd go bowling last. It kind of depended on the year. Like we always did both bowling and roller skating. It just wasn't like a set every year bowling was first or whatever. And there was a thing that started happening in the fall. I want to say my last year or two in youth group that was a mini, not camp, but it was held in Rhode Island. And I remember we stayed in like dorm rooms at a college and it was basically just praise bands and preaching for like 2 days straight. There's also one more thing I wanted to mention before I closed out this episode. There was in fact a winter camp for high schoolers that existed for a while, though I only remember going to it, I think, twice. In New England, most schools had a week-long February break over President's Day week, and while the winter camp might have existed beyond the last time I went, which was, I believe, my sophomore year of high school, looking back now, I don't remember my church going again after that. Like, they might have, and maybe I didn't because I was busy with other things, but anyway, I can't help but think it was nothing more than a weird cash grab. But I also don't know how they actually made money off of it because they still had to feed us 3 times a day and it didn't cost that much, just whatever. Anyway, winter camp was weird. It was only like 4 total days, maybe. It could have even only been 3, but it was like we would drive up to New Hampshire, which is like close to half a day. And then there was maybe 2 full days at winter camp. And then we'd come home the final day, obviously. But again, like it could have only been 1 full day. I don't know. Either way, it was fucking winter in New Hampshire, and while they had a day where they took the kids who wanted to ski to a nearby ski resort for the day, otherwise it was just meals, chapel, devotions, like no teams, no inspections, and listen, not all of those were exactly fun at summer camp either, but looking back, it's like, why did winter camp even exist? As I said, I only remember going to this for 2 years. I might have gone 3, but I don't think it was more than 3, and I really only remember 2 years. Honestly, I basically just recall it being cold and boring. And then one year, not sure if it was my freshman or sophomore year of high school, some of the girls from my church were smoking cigarettes in the bathroom of our room at the mansion and got caught. And it was a whole thing. And I don't remember if they got sent home. I feel like at least one of them was a pastor's daughter, so they didn't get sent home. But there was certainly a hammer thrown down about shit and a lot of warnings and threats and stuff. Whatever. Again, it's been a long time, and winter camp was just this kind of didn't really need to exist side event that I'm pretty sure anyone only ever went to because they were hoping to hook up with hot people from other churches. And I think that's really all I have to say about church camp. Maybe in the future, I will do a more detailed episode about like other experiences from youth group and whatnot, because I definitely had others and I have thoughts about them, but a lot of the thoughts I have, I'm not really sure if I'm really ready to share, I guess, at least not publicly. Like I'll talk to my friends about them, but as I mentioned earlier in the episode, there's definitely some kind of semi-traumatic things and ideas that were put in my head that I have gotten beyond and don't really care to think about anymore. So in conclusion, thank you for listening to me reminiscing about church summer camp from a time when I was, let's be real, pretty much a totally different person. As always, if you have any thoughts on personal stories of mine you're interested in hearing, or any particular rants or rambles you'd like me to go on, send me a DM at a Geek Saga on Blue Sky, Facebook, Instagram, Threads, or again, email ageeksaga@gmail.com. And if you enjoyed this episode, please don't forget to rate this podcast 5 stars on the podcatcher of your choice, and definitely follow me on the aforementioned social media accounts for the most current news and updates about this series. And please also consider backing our Patreon at patreon.com/geeksaga_entertainment for early access to not just these Impulsive Hyperfocus episodes, but also to future episodes from our 90s and Naughties Cringe Factor and any other podcasts we end up doing.